presentation for today. Yeah, it's been a few years since I've spoken here at Westside, and a lot of things have happened in that time, and things in my own life have changed. So you might have noticed in the bio that I was reading, a lot of those positions are former positions, and that's by design. I spent the last sort of couple of years enjoying a bit of a hiatus from active participation in the local humanist community. I spent about a decade and a half doing there, and I decided to focus on sort of more personal and private things in my life. And it's always a pleasure to come and join with congregations such as yours and share some of my thoughts. And the thoughts that I had today centered around a concept that I've been thinking about for a while. And I call this the fellowship of adversity. And you know, there's a lot of adversity in our lives. There's a lot of conflict in our lives in the wider society right now. And to a certain extent, this is always right. But I was thinking about some of the ideas around this challenges that we have, and the fellowship that often comes about as we interact with the adversity that we find in our lives. And the thing that I was most interested in starting off with is an initial concept that a lot of us are probably familiar with. It's probably something that is talked about quite a lot. It's a false dichotomy that there's one of the constants about us versus them. What is the us and what is the them? And when thinking about the us, what is it that actually binds us together? When we talk about this, where does that come from? Where does that us come from? And when I think about that, I think about things like jumping ahead a little bit here. Yeah, I'll try to point it directly at it. So I think about this verse. So I come from a Christian background originally, so when I think about sacred texts, the Christian scriptures come to mind. And when I think about this concept of us, what is it that the Bible says about us? And there's this verse that sticks out to me from Mark, where Jesus says, anyone who is not against us is for us. So the us is sort of defined by this concept of adversity. There's this us versus them. So anyone that's not against us is for us. Anyone that's not opposed to us is for us. It's part of that. And it seems like a very nice sort of inclusive way of looking at it. Well, as long as you're not actively opposing us, we'll accept you as part of our group. But in practice, what does this look like? Well, in practice, the us comes from things like our families. And that's sort of the initial, the core of what us is. I think of myself. My parents recently had a couple critical health problems in Ohio, where I'm from. And I drove 1,000 miles in a single day to get back to them to help them out. Because they're family. That's who they are, as my parents is kind of a core part of who I am, for better or for worse. And I think about my son, who I just a couple weeks ago sent to Ohio as well to spend 2 weeks with my brother and his kids. Because spending that time with family is not something that he often gets a chance to do. And that was very meaningful to him, very valuable. That was something that informed a core part of who he is. And I also think about my girlfriend's family. So her parents just came to visit us for some weeks as well. And she was very happy to see them and speak with them. And her kids are very happy to see their grandparents and talk with them. sort of reconnect. And so that family unit, that core identity is sort of where things start, but it also extends over to things like our friends, right? The people that we associate with, not because we have to, but because we want to. People that have shared interests with us, maybe they enjoy the same hobbies as us, they talk with us for whatever reason, but they become part of that us as well. And then I think about people who labor together with us, people who share in our work, who share our goals, our professional goals, the things that we're trying to accomplish in this world. They become part of the us. They understand who we are in kind of a way that nobody else does. People that labor shoulder to shoulder with us. And then I think about sort of the broader culture, the culture that we're sort of brought up in, and the little things, things like food, right? So when I came to Texas from Ohio, I was very excited to be able to sample all the great tamales that they had. So when I started dating a Puerto Rican, I learned about pasteles and how different they are, and how much more superior pasteles are. But these little tiny things that we sort of take for granted, that we sort of grow up in, that inform our culture and who we are, those help to inform us as well. And then there are things like traditions, right? Things that we don't really understand why we do them. We just know that we do them because our parents did them and our grandparents did them, and we just sort of keep them up. Things like holiday traditions. Why do we set off fireworks every 4th of July? Because everyone else does. Whatever. So little things like that, is being able to share those things, and seeing those traditions play out with other people helps to inform us. And then also religion, right? Religion actually comes from the Latin to bind together. Right? Religion can be the thing that binds us together. It can also be the thing that tears us apart when there are differences in religion. But very often, as we understand who we are and sort of where we fit in the world, we often think about the circle of people around us, just like here we are today on Sunday morning at church or work. This is an us that's formed right here, right now. So these are all different ideas of who the us is and where this comes from. But if there's the us, then there's also the them. And what in the world is wrong with them? Right? Because if the them were as good as us, they would be us. But they're not. If they were like us, they would be here. But they're not. Why not? What is wrong with them? And there's a huge list of things from, if you are interested in thinking about what is wrong with those people. Right? So, first and foremost, very, very common thing. Before I get to that, this is a different formulation of the verse from Mark. So this is actually the same exact idea, but it's expressed in a different way. So in Matthew, they have Jesus say, not those who are not against me. He says, those who are not with me are against me. So it's a little bit more exclusively in Matthew. They who do not gather in with me are away. Which means if you're not doing the same thing as me, you're doing the opposite. If you're not with me, you're against me. If you're not part of the us, you're with them. And them are those who are in opposition. And this is a very kind of troubling. And as I was mentioning, there's lots and lots of ways that we can find where people can be in opposition with us. First and foremost, being politics. Politics has all of them. Let's not pretend it's always been some love fest. Even going back to the founding of the country. Before that, as long as politics has been a thing, the struggle for power, people have always wanted to grab hold of and maintain and use power over other people. That's not new. But we see the expression of really them as much more distressing, much more upsetting now, perhaps than it has been. also somewhat trivial things, like pop culture. So when I was a kid, the big question, the big division was whether or not Star Wars was better than Star Trek. And you could only pick one. If you were for Star Wars, you could only be for Star Wars. If you were for Star Trek, you could only be for Star Trek. And now that's kind of changed. Now there's new Star Wars, there's new Star Trek, and now the division is whether the new stuff is better than the old stuff. And the whole concept has become very complicated. But there's all sorts of fights that people can fight over whether or not they like a certain thing in pop culture, whether it's Marvel versus DC, or whether it's whatever, right? And so all these fights can become very divisive and can cause a split between us versus them. There's also sports. Sports is a very big thing in Texas. It's a very big thing all over the country. And in Ohio, where I'm from, my brother is a football coach for a team that has had a rivalry going back 100 years. And it unites the town that he's in. They're all completely on the side of their own football. They have parades and they chant up and down. But what they're chanting is to defeat the next town over, right? So they have this sense of shared identity, but it's at the expense of the next town who are their neighbors. And they chant, beat McKinley, beat McKinley, beat McKinley, because that is what unites them. What unites them is the opposition to the next town over. In addition to sports, things like pop culture that was so much people, there are literal divisions that separate us from them. This is the construction of the Berlin Wall, which literally divided the city of Berlin between the Western, the UK and France and the United States versus the Soviet Union after the Second World War. They could not agree on how Germany should be allowed to proceed, so they actually cut in half. This was a literal division between us versus them. And even here in the United States, there have been not literal walls, but metaphorical lines drawn down neighborhoods. So this is redlining in New York City, the same sort of phenomenon that happened in nearly every major city. And all you really need to do is look at municipal maps of specific ethnic demographics to see the effects of this and how these lines that are drawn on maps divided us versus them nearly things. And then on the very personal one, the horrific, and somewhat ironic, it divided people who should not have been divided in the first place. So this is an example of violence that was committed during the Rwanda genocide. So during the Rwanda genocide, there were two different groups of people, the Hutus and the Tutsis, that lived in Rwanda. And the Hutus massacred Tutsis, whatever. The Tutsis were actually in the minority. The Hutus were much more populous. But for years, and actually this goes back to the origins of European colonialization, the Tutsis were given much more political power in Rwanda for the completely arbitrary reason that the Europeans thought that the Tutsis looked a little bit more racially upstanding. They looked a little bit more Ethiopian. There was more consideration for people who happened to look like that. For no other reason. In no other sense, they were completely the same. But the Tutsis were given power, and the Europeans divided the country because of that division. And the genocide that happened, I said it was a good thing, but it was an outgrowth of that division that was created artificially by the European colonists. And the person that you see here who was attacked by a machete, he was bludgeoned, sliced up with a machete, yet lived. This was not a Tutsi. Although many Tutsis were attacked in this way. This was a Hutu. But this was a Hutu man who disagreed with the genocide, opposed the genocide. So the The other Hutus that were perpetuating this imprisoned him and attacked him, cut his face up, just like they did. So these divisions that are created, this us versus them, all of a sudden it's uncomfortably easy for an us to become a them, the right circumstances. So what then do we do with this us versus them dichotomy? Is this a true dichotomy that we should understand? The world is organized on? Or is this a false dichotomy? I submit that this is a false dichotomy. The world does not need to work like this. The world does not need to be divided into us versus them, because doing so causes all these problems. So first, let's reject this false dichotomy. And then next, there's a concept that I call the ally of convenience. And this concept of a convenient ally comes originally from a Sanskrit military guide that was written thousands of years ago in India. It's somewhat akin to the art of war. It's a guidebook for military strategy. And in this work, which is called the Rivera, the guidance is: you're a king who is in control of a kingdom. The guidance says anyone who borders your territory is your enemy. That is the only reason, it's the only condition that must be met. As long as they border your territory, they are your enemy. But anyone who borders your enemy's territory, but does not border your territory, is your friend. So this is framed as a work of, or as a concept of military strategy. If you are a king, if you're running a kingdom, anybody on your border, you should think about your enemy. Anyone who's your neighbor should be thought of as your enemy. But if your neighbor has a neighbor that's not your neighbor as well, they're your friend. Because they can antagonize your enemy, but not necessarily you. And this concept is a little bit better known under the aphorism, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But so what does this mean? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, it means that anyone, first of all, that this concept that people on your board, people who are neighboring to you, and you should attack, they should be your enemies. Right? This goes back thousands of years in culture. This goes back further in our evolutionary history. This is a photograph of chimpanzees at war. I don't know if anybody has ever heard of the Gombe chimpanzee. But this was something that was described by Dr. Jane Goodall as she was doing her studies of chimpanzee behavior and sociology in the Congo. And the idea, the early idea of how chimpanzees, of course, are our closest relatives, evolutionary speaking, but the earliest thoughts about how they operate is that they were relatively peaceful. They sort of sit around in these troops and they eat, they groom each other, they might have internal struggles for power, but that's pretty much it. It was seen as somewhat idyllic, primitive. But during this period of time, as they watched these chimpanzees, they noticed that there was one troop of chimpanzees on the northern side of the forest, and another one to the southern side. And they saw this happen spontaneously, that groups of male chimpanzees would peel off from the northern tribe, and they would venture down the territory of the southern tribe. And whenever they would find one chimpanzee from the other tribe, they would all jump on it and tear them from them. When I say tear them, I mean that they would tear pieces of flesh, skin, horrible, awful way of dying. And they did this over and over. Over and over, they would make incursions into the southern troop, and eventually the southern troop was no more. The few that remained fled someplace else, and the females that remained primarily were absorbed into the northern troop. And the northern troop took over both territories. So this concept that if someone is on your border, they are your enemy, you should destroy them. This goes back far into our evolutionary history. And and it's something that manifests even in relatively modern times. So we have an example of just after the Civil War, one of the most famous family feuds in United States history, the Hatfields versus the McCoys. This was a fight that lasted for many years. This involved two extended families, the Hatfields and the McCoys, on either side of the river. One was in West Virginia, one family was in Ohio. If you were to pick any of these people out and then lay them all together and look at them in a line, you would not be able to distinguish one from the other. They hated each other. They hated each other. And what's more, although this was immediately after the Civil War, this was not something that really extended the violence of the Civil War. Some people thought initially. So the first person that was killed was someone who had been a Union soldier. But every other person who was killed on both sides, both families, were allied with the Confederacy. So all of these people were just Southern affiliated rednecks who just happened to be in different sides of the river, in different family groups. And that was all it took for them to murder each other in broad daylight, sometimes at night. There was one instance where someone went over and snuck over the river and set fire to another family's house while they slept in the ground. Also a horrible way to die. But just thinking about the borders that exist and trying to figure out the strategy of, okay, well then who is my friend? The person whose border is not on mine, but maybe bothering somebody else's. This is something that we've seen play out in human history very recently as well. And one of the greatest examples is the alliance between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union during World War II. This shows a conference that was held in Yalta towards the end of the Second World War, when it was sort of a given thing that Germany was going to be defeated, and the Allies, represented here by Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, wanted to figure out how Europe should be divided up and what the resolution should be after the war was over. And Stalin was no real ally to the West. And yet they were militarily linked for that period of time. But we've already seen how that played out in Berlin. Resulted in building of a wall, resulted in a prolonged Cold War, building of nuclear weapons, and tremendous anxiety on both sides. The enemy of your enemy. And more recently, we've seen this with the situation in the Middle East. It is relatively recently resolved now. This is Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands with Saddam Hussein. This is somewhat a famous picture that came to light after the invasion of Iraq, after 9/11. Prior to 9/11, prior to that time, Iraq was an ally of the United States. And Saddam Hussein was someone who would find himself shaking hands with Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense. And why? Oh, because they both hated Iran. So Iraq and the United States were both in opposition to Iran, so it became expedient for them to create an allyship. That ultimately resulted in a very different way. But the thing about this phrase, if the enemy of your enemy is your friend. If that is something that is true, then you can phrase this in a slightly different way. It sort of implies another conclusion. If the enemy of your enemy is your friend, then the friend of your enemy may also be your enemy. And that is a very difficult thing to wrestle with. That concept, the friend of my enemy is my enemy. That increases the number of enemies that you might have if you look at it that way. And that is something that happens today. Very frequently, again, there's conflict, there's adversity that we find ourselves in. But it's not just one person and another person anymore. It's you against that person and any friends that they might have. You're in opposition to them. This was expressed pretty clearly by George W. Bush immediately after 9/11. For those of you who lived through that, as I did, President Bush got on television at the end of that day, fateful day, and he expressed a concept that he used, or his administration used, to justify the invasion of Afghanistan and eventually to justify the invasion of Iraq and the deposition of both governments, including Saddam Hussein, our previous ally. And the Bush doctrine is expressed this way that he gave during that speech. He said, "We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harm them." Which means we are not just going after the terrorists. We are going after anyone who is friends with me. A friend, my enemy, is my enemy. This is the Bush doctrine. And that concept defined American foreign policy as prosecuted in the war on terrorism for the next 20 years, at least. We make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who are. Friend of my enemy is my enemy. And this led to the invasion of Afghanistan. This led to the invasion of Iraq. And both of those were successfully prosecuted by our military. Both countries were invaded. The governments were down, deposed. But did it make a lasting change? Is the world now better for having looked at the world that way? Well, in Afghanistan, perhaps not. This is the evacuation of Kabul. The last American troops pulled out, and the allies that we had locally, friends that we had made, the friends against our enemies, many of them were left behind. The Taliban took back over the government in Afghanistan. In Iraq, it's a little bit different. In Iraq, there is a prime minister still. There is a government still in Iraq that is friendly with the United States. This is Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi 2 years ago, shaking hands, announcing the end of the combat mission in Iraq. And the government that we helped install is still in power. So looking at the world in that lens, saying to yourself, the enemy, the friend of my enemy is my enemy as well. That might not work out well for us. Look at the world. And finally, a concept that I find sort of especially troubling. I call this the razor of hypocrisy. Now, I have a house now that has teenagers, preteens, and they are, dare I say, experts in identifying hypocrisy. And I think one of the reasons for this is because when you're at that age, you're transitioning from being a young child, looking at the world in a very trusting way. And that the things people tell you, the things that adults tell you, are told in earnest and for good reason. And your parents know best, your grandparents know best, your teacher knows best, and the best thing for you to do as a child is to simply follow those directions, follow that advice, follow what they tell you to do. But as your mentality transitions into something a little bit more adult, you start seeing that the world doesn't exactly act like that. And even these figures of authority don't exactly act like that. The rules that they may have you follow, maybe they don't follow themselves. And there might be good reasons why they don't follow themselves. They might be rules only for kids, not for adults. But that's hard for you to see. And so teenagers start seeing the world as just one huge landscape of hypocrisy. And so they start using your own words against you. Well, you said this. And then you have to be dealing with your own advice, your own directives being thrown back at you. And when I think about that, I think of the verse in Matthew where Jesus said, "Put your sword back for all who draw the sword will die." Those who use directives and make orders might find themselves on the opposite side. In fact, more than might, right? All those who draw the sword will soon die. Right? So what Jesus is saying there is that no, this is an inevitability. If you use these attacks on other people, these attacks that you make will be made on you as well. And, there's sort of the concept of the old gunfighter who, at a certain point, you become so well known, you become so famous as a gunfighter, everyone is coming for you, everyone wants to take you down. So if you're a gunfighter, if you're a famous gunfighter, how are you likely to die? In a gunfight. Right? In a gunfight. And here in Fort Worth, we have sort of the famous example of Butch Cassidy, Sundance Kid. In the movie, they were shown in a kind of a romantic way as becoming the victims of the violence that they perpetrated. Right? Their actions came back to get them in the end. The violence that they perpetrated was visited upon them. And in the movie, it seems very romantic and lovely. But in the real world, the violence that you put out into the world is ugly. And I think of Rex Hoyerman, who was recently discovered to be a serial killer in Gilgo Beach, Long Island. And he put himself out there as an upstanding member of his community. He was an architect, he was a homeowner, he was responsible, he was married. Yet he was doing these horrible things in secret. He was doing violence in secret, living a very different life. That is murder as hypocrisy. I find it very difficult to believe that you could do murder in any other way that does not betray you as a hypocrite. Because anyone who lives in this society, we expect to live in a society, we expect to be treated well. We expect to be respected. But murder betrays betrayal, and it becomes a kind of a hypocrisy. I also think of this individual here. This is John Stevens, known as Fluke Skywalker. You see, he has a very obvious resemblance to an aged Mark Hamill from the new Star Wars movies. He was someone who dressed up like Luke Skywalker movies. He would do a lot of events, a lot of charity events. He would raise a lot of money, and he would donate it to the Ronald McDonald House, which seems great. And Ronald McDonald House, if you don't know, is a charity organization that provides medical care and support to kids and their families that they can't otherwise afford it. And this guy, John Stevens, was doing a lot of work for several years, raising money and then showing up looking like a Skywalker. Just this week, he was discovered to have child pornography on his phone and on his computer, hidden in different places. And he was booked and arrested in the Hamilton County Jail. He was living a very different life than what he showed to the world. He was living a life of hypocrisy. And that caught up with him. The same thing that he was putting out there was not what he was really living. And it eventually caught up. The thing about hypocrisy is also that sometimes we don't expect the behaviors that we see, the behaviors that we learn about. I'm thinking of one of the most famous figures in the 20th century, Mahatma Gandhi, right? Who was crucial, who was leading the fight for Indian independence. And he is looked up to. He was called Mahatma by the Indians. He also slept naked with his grandnieces every night. Every night. And this was known, but not very well popular. Every night he was sleeping naked with his grandnieces. Now, he would say that it was so that he could ensure that his celibacy was as pure as it could possibly be. That was what he said. We believe that. Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a wonderful advocate for civil rights in this country, also a perpetual adulterer. He's constantly cheating on his wife, Rivera. In fact, on the very day that he was killed, he was with another woman in that hotel. And she wanted to go with him. She wanted to go in the ambulance with him to the hospital. But the men that he was there with, his team, looked like this. On the very day that he was killed, he was cheating on his wife. And what his associate, Ralph Abernathy, later in his autobiography, said, we all understood and believed in the biblical prohibition against sex outside of marriage. It was just that he had a particularly difficult time with that temptation. Everybody knew that he wasn't the moral exemplar that he presented himself to be. But they also allowed him to make moral pronouncements regarding such as these. What does Matthew say again about hypocrisy? It says, do not judge, and you will not be judged, because the judgments you give are the judgments you will get, and the standard you use will be the standard used by you. And I like it a little bit better, the metaphor that you can use later. It says, this is Jesus talking again. Why do you observe the splinter in your brother's eye and never notice the great log in your own? And how dare you say to your brother, let me take that splinter out of your eye, when look, there is a great log in your own. Hypocrite, take the log out of your eye first, and then you will see clearly enough to take the splinter out of your brother's eye. Hypocrisy is a blade that cuts both ways. And perhaps we should be careful about how we present ourselves. Are we ourselves consistent with who we claim to be when we're thinking about others, who they are? Are they consistent with what they claim to be? And this is why I think all of this, and I bring this all together, right? I think about the fellowship of the person. This idea that we come together, we define ourselves by what we're opposed to. we will not. And I think we clearly divide our society just by instinct. This is something that comes to us from our evolutionary history. We divide our society between insiders and the outsiders. And when we do that, we antagonize those who make common cause with our enemies, and those we perceive as our enemies, the outsiders. But when we do that, I think we should remember we are ourselves subject to the same attacks in our neighborhoods. And that is why I think that we must be careful to avoid the fellowship